Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first online lecture for the Politics of U.S. Public Policy. I just want to start by thanking all of you for getting online and doing this despite the chaos and problems we face all around us. It's a really difficult time, and I'm really grateful to have the chance to keep teaching you. But I also understand that you are all facing a lot of dislocations and understand that it may be a little harder for you to follow along. So I'm going to be doing these lectures online, streaming them for you on the day of the lecture, and then posting them onto YouTube so that you can get access to them later. This is all new to me, so please bear with me. Okay, today we're going to be talking about market failure and collective action, and that is a setup for a set of lectures that continue through next week on the ways in which the failure of markets and the ways in which the failures of government can be seen in American environmental and energy policy, and in particular, the response to climate change. And we will also, I'm really happy to report, be having some guest visits for this class. Some of my very favorite colleagues, Veshla Weaver, who is here at Yale and is really the world's leading expert on the politics of criminal justice. Alex Hurdle-Fernandez at Columbia University, a specialist on labor politics and business power, and Lee Drutman from the New America Foundation, who was a student of my frequent co-author, Paul Pierson, and now studies political reform and lobbying, and has just written a book that is really provocative about, quote, breaking the two-party doom loop. And I'm having you read excerpts from that for the class. So, as I said, we are moving into a new unit, and each of these units has a foundation section and then a policy and action section. And today's lecture is going to focus on the underlying social dilemmas and market failures that motivate the use of public power. And by this, I just mean, why government, right? Why does government have this special role when it comes to dealing with market failure, and why do markets fail in the first place? But as you know, I'm a political scientist, not an economist, and I had you read some economic readings, but I'm going to move on Wednesday to really taking the politics of this area seriously and thinking about the ways in which market failure and what might be called government failure come together. And in particular, powerful corporations aren't just actors in the market, they're also actors in our politics. I'll start with an example that I hope doesn't hit too close to home, and then I'll turn to this basic area of social dilemmas that you read about in the online text, The Economy. And I'll talk a bit about what I see as the sort of most ubiquitous market failure. This is so-called externalities. Externalities are when the cost that consumers and producers are paying attention to isn't the cost to society as a whole. We talk about negative externalities like pollution. These are costs that aren't taken into account by consumers and producers, but are huge for society. So we'll look at that sort of most common form of market failure, but I'll also look at some other forms that are quite common. Finally, I'll conclude with just a little bit of a discussion about how we should think about market failures, given that we know that democratic governments are subject to their own biases. And indeed, we'll be thinking about those biases on Wednesday as we look at the political economic dimensions of government policies to deal with market failure. Okay, so I said I would start with a contemporary example, and there's really nothing more contemporary than thinking about the crisis that we're facing today. As all of you know, having paid attention to the news, the central problem, the reason I'm teaching at home, is that if we do not socially distance from each other, right, we're going to see a massive increase, an exponential increase in cases of Coded-19, and those cases are going to overwhelm our health system and potentially lead to hundreds of thousands, and even in some of the estimates, millions of deaths. So what we need to do as individuals and as a society trying to shape the individual response, what we need to do is to essentially shut down our society. And that is a very hard thing to do. And in particular, we want to slow the spread of the infection so that we don't see this huge spike in cases that exceeds the capacity of our healthcare system, and particularly the capacity of our system to keep people alive. Ventilators are a crucial issue here. Second, of course, we want to try to buy the time we need to deal with this crisis, and in particular to develop a vaccine. You can see here that this is from the Financial Times, that the trajectory is exponential. And that might be a little hard to see at first, but take a look at that y-axis, the one that's going up and down. And you'll see that those are actually that's actually a log scale. So we're talking about tens of thousands of cases at the top of that scale. And this is a common way in which economists look at exponential growth. The issue is one that exists at both the social level, right? How would we as a society respond? How will our public policymakers respond? State governments, city governments, the federal government. But it's also an individual level decision. And this was really driven home recently by this Imperial College report, which argued that we're going to see an enormous number of cases if we don't all observe very serious social distancing. The number there, the 2.2 million deaths, is a really scary number, but that's a number that assumes absolutely no response, and we've already seen a substantial response. But we're also seeing people who are going out despite the warnings of their government, and increasing efforts of governments to try to figure out how to ensure that these calls for social distancing are actually observed. And so this is where government coercion comes in, right? The Imperial London report gave us a picture of the total cumulative cases and potential deaths. But just today in the New York Times, there was a really revealing picture of how much the spread of the virus could be slowed by what are called here severe control measures. And this would really push the peak of the virus back months and give us the vital time we need to get prepared, and also lessen the time between the outbreak of the virus and the development of an effective vaccine. So when you look at a figure like that, you're struck that there are still people, yes, on the beaches and in sunny Miami.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying. You know, we've been waiting for Miami spring break for a while. About 2 months we've had this trip planned. 2-3 months. So we're just out here having a good time. Whatever happens, happens.
Like, it's really messing up with my spring break. What is there to do here other than go to the bars or the beach, and they're closing all of it? It's really messing. I think they're blowing it way out of proportion. I think it's doing way too much.
Doing us bad. We need a refund. This virus ain't that serious. It's serious. It's more serious things out there like hunger and poverty, and we need to address that.
We're gonna roll with we're just living for the moment. We're just gonna do what happens when it happens. When stuff closes, we're gonna do it when it closes. But besides that, we're just trying to have the best trip we can.
Okay, so I will offer no commentary on that. Only, I guess I would say, is I'm sure that none of those people were Yale College students. I'm going to talk about the dilemma that is posed by particularly young people sort of debating whether or not to be out and interacting with others given the seriousness of this pandemic. I'm calling this a COVID-19 game. I put game in quotes because it's obviously just a game as in game theoretic games. And it's very similar to some of the social dilemmas that you read about in the economy. Now, we start with the assumption that getting COVID-19 is a really bad thing. It has a lot of negative utility, and it's dangerous even for young people, as we're learning. But of course, it is costly to people to socially distance. It's hard, and so that has negative utility as well. So the negative D term here is basically the cost to an individual of social distancing, and the negative C term here is basically the cost of getting COVID-19. Now, the point is, even if the cost of COVID-19 is really high for individuals, it's possible that if everyone else is observing social distancing, or almost everyone else, your risk of getting COVID-19 might be low. I'm assuming that for the moment here. So let's think about this as a series of decisions, a decision tree. So the first question you're asking is, do I socially distance? Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a student who has a ticket to Miami, but isn't sure whether or not they should make the trip. And if you decide to socially distance, there's a better chance that you're not going to get the virus, but you could get it. So that would be the worst possible outcome, right? You bear all this cost of socially distancing and you also get sick. But hopefully the outcome that you get is that you don't get sick, and thus you just bear that cost of social distancing. So what if you, on the other hand, say, screw it, I'm heading down to the beaches? So you say no, and that is a good outcome for you in the sense that you don't have to bear any cost of social distancing. But of course, you could get COVID-19, and the outcome that these Blythe College students are hoping for, I guess, is that they'll become successful free riders. Right? Chance of that depends a lot on what other people do, but just thinking about the game this way, you suddenly see that there are a bunch of calculations that are coming in. And what we have here under sort of realistic scenarios could be a social dilemma. It's a social dilemma because it might be rational for you to free ride on the efforts of others, to end up as one of those people who was lucky enough to have lots of fun in spring break and not to get COVID-19. But of course, you are putting a lot of other people at risk. And it only works if you're one of the few who don't socially distance, because if you do get sick, it's obviously worse than having to endure not going down to the beaches for spring break. But I want to note that if you listen to those college students, and it's hard, they may also be misperceiving the risks that they face. And if you think the probability that you're going to get sick is much smaller than it really is, right? This virus ain't that serious, said one of the thoughtful commentators we just listened to. Then that's a misperception, or you might just not be thinking ahead, right? As the last reveler said, we're just living for the moment. So this is a classic social dilemma, presented in terms that I think are quite vivid to us today. Now, lest you think that I'm just speculating here or throwing out some kind of crazy example, you can see a little bit of evidence of this misperception in the response of Americans to the COVID-19 pandemic. When in the early part of the crisis, President Trump was playing down the severity, and the many conservative media sources, particularly Fox News, were doing the same, there was this striking negative inverse relationship between support for President Trump, and thus presumably more reliance on conservative media and Trump's leadership statements, and searching on Google for hand sanitizers. And that relationship is kind of hard to believe, but it exists there. And you should see here, if you look back before the COVID-19 pandemic, there's no relationship down there on the bottom right of the screen. And the relationship has now all but disappeared, presumably because the president has recognized the severity of this, and that many conservative media sources are starting to cover this more. So the point is that misperception is a big deal. People are behaving not rationally on the basis of the best available information. They're behaving sometimes rationally. We'll talk more about that in a moment, on the basis of the information they receive, which could be very distorted. So what are the lessons of this? Well, the first and most obvious is that you can get these cases in which people behaving rationally produce really bad outcomes. This is the classic prisoner's dilemma type game, where basically people are much worse off, but they still behave in ways that produce that bad outcome. And of course, if you add in irrationality, you might get even worse outcomes. In some cases, irrationality might protect us from our own worst instincts. In other cases, it just compounds the problem. And I think in the case that we're talking about, it actually compounds the problem. The other thing that we see here is just how interdependent we are. In complex modern societies, as Paul Pierson and I write in American Amnesia, spillovers of the sort that we see here are ubiquitous. And this is, of course, one of the reasons you need government. Government has, as we have learned, this very important ability to require that people do certain things. But that's also a source of failures of government, as we'll see in a moment, because, of course, people can capture government and force it to do things that are not optimal for society. But government has this capacity that markets don't, which is to require people to do things. Now, it's worth noting that there are cases in which people can band together and collectively solve market failures without government, and I'll talk more about the potential for that and its limits. Okay, let's go back to our familiar public goods, right? So public goods, as you guys said, are goods that are non-excludable. You can't prevent someone from receiving them, and non-rival. That is, one person's use of them doesn't diminish other people's use of them. It is time for my very favorite thing, a 2x2 matrix. And you may recall this from earlier in the class, right? So we have four kinds of goods based on these two characteristics. We have your classic kind of private goods, things that are both rival and excludable. And these are cases in which, markets can often work relatively well for supplying them. But there are a lot of cases in which goods are either non-rival or non-excludable. So first, thinking of this case of non-rival goods that are excludable, these are really natural monopolies. And if you think about it, right, it's almost zero cost for Amazon to expand the number of customers. A new customer, a new product offered is zero cost, and same is true of social media platforms like Facebook. But this gives them the ability to basically scale up and crowd out or wipe out their competitors. So that's a kind of classic case of a natural monopoly. The cases from the past are ones where we had areas like water supply where it just made no sense to have more than one supplier. On the other hand, we have what are called common pool resources, and this is a problem that we're going to think a little more about. We've already mentioned it, and it's discussed in the reading, The Economy. But if you think about these common pool resources, you can't really stop people from tapping into them, from fishing in the ocean and getting the fish. But if everyone does it, of course, then it's a real problem. So they're clearly rival in consumption. And then finally, your classic public goods, right? These are things that are neither rival in consumption nor excludable. And the classic example, right, is like a lighthouse or a tornado siren. But as we've seen, most even libertarians tend to believe that police and defense should be provided by the government, that it is a pure public good. So I mentioned this idea of overfishing, common pool resources. And this gets us to the tragedy of the commons, which is a term that comes from Garrett Hardin. There's a very clever cartoon actually on this page. Why is this so clever? Because the lacking dialogue is actually a reference to the fact that you can often solve common pool resource problems by having communication of various sorts. Usually you need more than just communication. Telling folks not to fish isn't going to work, but perhaps you can tell them not to fish and back that up with enforceable quotas or very strong social sanctions. So Hardin's famous paper has led people to be very pessimistic. There is some about common pool resources. There is some evidence that you can solve them, but without government policy. But it generally requires smaller groups, dense social networks, high levels of trust, and so on. Now, I said that the sort of number one case of market failure, the kind of archetypal case, is when you have an externality. And I already mentioned that there are positive and negative externalities. And the important thing is that self-interested rational market actors don't care about externalities. And indeed, it's important to understand that if they were to try to be more altruistic, say, and worry about these externalities, they would get crushed by actors who didn't in the market. So there's a famous quote attributed to Chuck Prince, one of the Wall Street leaders during the financial crisis, which said basically when the music is playing, as in musical chairs, you have to keep moving around, right? That he couldn't not participate in the speculation that was taking place. And it's worth noting that externalities and public goods are closely related. So basically, when all the benefits of a good are external, then because you can't exclude people from the benefit, then you have essentially a pure public good, right? There were a number of examples of market failures provided in the economy reading, and I just reproduced that figure here. And you don't have to know these different terms. Some of them are pretty common, like negative externality. Others, like, I don't know, public bad, are a little bit more idiosyncratic. But the point is just that there are a lot of cases in which markets fail. And a lot of them involve, as in these cases, externalities, right? So there are other problems that markets have. I told you there are a lot of ways markets can fail. And one of these is what I call informational failures here, but there are other ways in which it gets discussed. This is particularly problematic, as we've discovered in healthcare and health insurance. And in our discussion of health insurance, we talked about adverse selection when health plans are subject to an adverse mix of risk. That is, more people who are sick are signing up for health insurance. So the important thing to understand about these types of insurance market failures is they're really about information, right? They're about the ways in which information is distributed between consumers and suppliers, or sometimes they arise in the case of workplaces. So it's information distribution between workers and employers. And so there are sort of the general cases of kind of asymmetric information. I also want to just mention that problem I mentioned earlier, the Chuck Prince problem, we could call it, is really a problem of moral hazard, right? And moral hazard is basically arises because whenever somebody is protected from a risk, they in theory have an incentive to engage in that risky behavior. So if you protect the banks against the consequences of their own bad behavior, then you might encourage that bad behavior. Now you might ask, well, why is that at all about information? And well, it's about information because it's so hard for an insurance company to essentially monitor and control the actions of those who are insured. And that's really the way in which these information failures play out. It's just almost impossible to write insurance contracts and to monitor, to enforce them in ways that aren't potentially gameable by those who have more information, namely those who are the ones who are insured by those contracts. Now, there's another class of failures that I just want to mention. I call these behavioral failures. And these are basically failures of the market that are quite common, but really are not due to rational people behaving in their best interest. And that resulting in suboptimal behavior. These are basically cases in which people don't behave rationally. And it turns out that happens a lot. And we know that from the work of some really pioneering psychologists and economists. And one of them is pictured here. I'll stop for a moment. You can think about it. Do you know who this is? So happily smiling at the camera. A hint is that his frequent co-author is Danny Kahneman, the Nobel laureate. And indeed, this is Amos Tversky, who is a famous Israeli psychologist who last died relatively young, who, along with Kahneman, did the pioneering work on how people behave in ways that don't comport with the kind of standard rational model of individual behavior that economists were working with at the time. And these papers go back to the 1970s. And what are some of the things that Tversky and Kahneman found? Well, they found that framing effects matter a lot. And let me give you an example that's topical. So think about this one for a moment. So think about it. Which would you choose, A or B? And then just make a quick decision. Okay. Now remember that. Okay. Now think about this one. So again, don't think too hard. Just ask yourself, if somebody had told you this before I framed it as a behavioral failure, what would you choose? So it turns out, and I have the numbers here, that in this first example, 72% of people, and they've done this experiment across huge groups of people, college students, national popular surveys, and so on. So if you look at those results, about 3/4 of people, 72%, choose option A. And they choose option A because gains are emphasized, right? So if program A is adopted, exactly 200 people will be saved, right? Now, I guess I should say right now, if you haven't figured it out, that these are exactly the same outcomes, right? And I know these hit a little close to home right now, although this is actually something that comes from a study in a paper that was written 30 or 40 years ago. Okay, here, the result is the opposite, basically. Like, 2/3 to 3/4 of people choose option B, right? Because it's framed here in terms of losses. Even though, again, 400 people will die is the same with 600 people as 200 people will be saved. So that's just an example of how framing matters. People tend to be loss averse, right? So that's the loss versus gain here, that the kind of myopia we were talking about before is a common problem. And in fact, certain industries, the cigarette industry, take advantage of that myopia, right? They try to get people to not think too much about the future. So I mentioned loss aversion. The other one I would just say is there's a huge amount of evidence that people just kind of stick with the option they choose, which is sometimes a good thing. So when you auto-enroll people into a 401k retirement plan, they just keep the retirement plan, which is good. Or if you give them a broad mix of stocks, they'll just stick with that broad mix of stocks. It's not always good, right? Like, how many of us are signed up for like 35 different services online that we don't use, right? But there's a high level of inertia. Once you are in it, you tend to keep in it. So let me sum up the basic message of what I've been saying so far. There are a lot of reasons why markets fail. You probably have heard about perfect competition, right? Many buyers, many sellers, products that are very similar, and you get this wonderful phenomenon where the market produces this one clear signal of the price that optimizes for society as a whole. That would be great. But that is rare. And just like democracy, perfect competition is really an ideal. So some markets get very close, but big areas of our economy, and here are three that I think you should really focus on: healthcare, finance, and energy. It just so happens that healthcare, finance, and energy constitute something like half our economy. Healthcare alone is a fifth. But if you think about those three areas, each of them has a serious market failure. With healthcare, it's all of the asymmetric information that we've been talking about that allows, for example, insurance markets not to work well, and for providers to use their greater amount of information to charge consumers more. With finance, it is the clear externality problem of systemic financial risk. So when all these financiers engage in risky behavior, they're imposing that on the rest of society. So too with energy, right? We have the mother of all market failures, that is climate change, not to mention just ordinary pollution. Consumers and producers have no incentive to take those large external effects into account when they make their decisions. So the question isn't whether markets fail. The question is whether you can remedy these market failures. And that means you have to think about politics. You have to think about how well government policies might be able to address them. But I really want to emphasize that in politics, you're always working in a world of second best. So you're working with flawed markets and flawed government, and you have to think about how to make government work better so that it can better deal with flawed markets.